The phone call lasted 4 seconds. No words, just breathing, shallow, broken, the kind that comes after someone has been crying so long they've forgotten how to stop. Then silence. Then the line went dead. Marcus Hale stared at the screen for a moment, mud still drying on his tactical gloves, the smell of gunpowder faint on his jacket. He was standing in a parking lot outside a federal building in Arlington, Virginia, 40 minutes from debriefing, 3 states away from the small town in rural Ohio where his sister taught 5th grade. He hadn't spoken to Claire in 6 weeks. She never called him during operations. She knew better than to call at all, most of the time. Not because she didn't want to, but because she understood his world well enough to know that a ringing phone could mean a distraction that cost lives. She only called when something was wrong. He dialed back immediately. It rang 7 times. No answer. Marcus was in his truck with the engine running before the 8th ring finished. Millhaven, Ohio was the kind of town that looked peaceful from the highway and revealed itself slowly, the way old wounds do. Population just under 4,000. 1 stoplight. A grain elevator on the east side of town that had been operational since 1962, and a Dollar General that had replaced the only bookstore sometime around 2009. The kind of place where everyone knew your name, your business, your mistakes, and kept a running tally of all 3. Claire Hale had grown up here. Left at 18 on a partial scholarship to Ohio State, studied education, came back at 26 when their mother got sick. She'd meant to stay 6 months. That was 9 years ago. She taught at Millhaven Elementary, room 14, 5th grade, reading, writing, a little history. She had 22 students, most of whom came from families that worked the fields or the auto parts plant on Route 9, kids who didn't always have lunch money or clean jackets or someone to help with homework. Claire noticed all of it. She kept granola bars in her desk drawer. She stayed late 3 days a week for any student who needed extra help. She bought school supplies with her own money every August without telling anyone, because the one time she'd mentioned it in the staff meeting, the response from the room had been a silence so pointed it felt like a blade. That was the thing about Millhaven Elementary. The building was small, the staff was small, and the social structure within it was as rigid and unforgiving as anything Claire had ever encountered. There was a hierarchy, and she had never been part of it. At the top sat Diane Prewitt. Diane had been teaching 4th grade at Millhaven for 19 years. She was 51, twice divorced, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from being the most important person in a very small room for a very long time. She organized the staff potlucks, ran the informal social calendar, and had the ear of Principal Gerald Mack in a way that was never spoken about openly but was understood by everyone. When Diane laughed at something, the other women laughed. When Diane didn't like someone, that someone found out gradually, in ways that were difficult to name. A comment here, an exclusion there, a tone of voice that said everything without saying anything at all. Diane had decided sometime in Claire's first year back that she didn't like her. The reasons were never stated outright, but Claire had her theories. She was younger. She was quieter. The kids talked about her in the hallway in a way they didn't talk about the other teachers. And once, at a staff Christmas party, Principal Mack had said that Claire's reading scores were the best in the school. And he'd said it in front of everyone, including Diane, who had smiled with her mouth and not her eyes and never forgotten it. For 9 years, Claire had absorbed it. The comments about her clothing, always delivered as concern, never as cruelty, which made them impossible to confront. The way her ideas in staff meetings were ignored until someone else repeated them. The lunch table where she was technically never excluded but never quite included either. The group chat she'd been added to and then quietly removed from without explanation. She had learned to make herself small, to agree when she didn't agree, to smile at things that weren't funny. To carry herself through the building with her head slightly down, not because she was ashamed, but because she had learned that drawing attention to herself only gave them more material to work with. Her students never saw any of it. In room 14, Claire Hale was fully herself, warm, sharp, funny in a dry way that 10-year-olds found inexplicably hilarious. She read to them every Friday afternoon, sitting on the edge of her desk with the book in her lap. She remembered every one of their birthdays. She had a wall in the back of her classroom she called the Wall of Hard Things, where students could anonymously post something they were struggling with, and she would address them, gently, without naming names, during morning circle. She loved that room. It was the one place in Millhaven that still felt like hers. She should have known they'd find a way to take it from her, too. It started, as most cruelties do, with something that seemed small. 3 weeks before everything fell apart, Diane had organized what she called a staff wellness afternoon, an after-school gathering in the teacher's lounge to celebrate the end of the standardized testing period. Wine, cheese, music from a Bluetooth speaker someone had brought. Claire had been invited, technically. The invitation had been slipped under her classroom door on a sticky note, which was how she knew it wasn't genuine. Everyone else had been told in person. She went anyway. She didn't know why exactly. Maybe she was tired of sitting alone in room 14 while the sound of laughter drifted down the hallway. Maybe she thought for one irrational moment that things had changed. They hadn't. She stood at the edge of the lounge for 20 minutes with a plastic cup of warm Chardonnay, speaking to no one, spoken to by no one, watching Diane hold court in the center of the room with 3 other teachers: Sandra Felch, who taught 3rd grade, Pam Kowalski, the school librarian, and Beth Arnett, a first-year teacher who had been absorbed into the group with an efficiency that Claire recognized and pitied. At some point, Diane glanced over at her, just a glance. Then she leaned toward Sandra and said something Claire couldn't hear, and Sandra pressed her lips together to suppress a smile, and that was enough. Claire set her cup down on the counter and walked out. In the parking lot, sitting in her 2011 Honda Civic with the heater running, she called Marcus. She hadn't planned to. Her hands just moved. But it rang through to voicemail. He was in the field. She knew that. She shouldn't have called. And she sat there in the dark for a while before driving home. That night she told herself it didn't matter, that she was a grown woman, that she had survived worse, that what happened in that lounge was nothing. A look, a half smile, nothing she could point to, nothing she could prove. But something had shifted in her chest that evening. Something that, without her realizing it, had begun counting down. The morning it happened, Claire arrived at school at 7:15 as always. She made coffee in the break room, corrected the last of a set of book reports, and had her classroom ready 15 minutes before the first bell. Nothing felt different. The October sky outside her windows was the color of old pewter, low clouds moving fast, the kind of Ohio morning that smells like rain before it arrives. She'd worn her gray cardigan, the soft one, slightly worn at the elbows, that she'd had for years. Comfortable. Her armor, in a way. By 3:30 that afternoon, that cardigan would be the only thing left of the person she'd been that morning. The students left at 3:10. By 3:20, the building was mostly empty. The buses gone, the hallways quiet, only a few teachers still in their rooms. Claire was at her desk grading when she heard the lounge door open down the hall. Then voices. Then laughter. The specific pitch of it. The one she'd learned to recognize over 9 years. Sharp and intimate and excluding. She should have stayed in her room. She didn't. She went to the lounge to retrieve the lunch container she'd left in the refrigerator that morning, and she pushed open the door, and 4 faces turned toward her with expressions that told her, before a single word was spoken, that she had walked into something she was not supposed to see, or perhaps something they had been waiting for her to walk into. Diane was holding a pair of scissors. She was smiling. "Claire," she said, in the warm, friendly voice she sometimes used when she wanted to make something sound reasonable that wasn't. "We were just talking about you." Claire looked at the scissors, at the faces around the room, at the chair that had been placed with deliberate casualness in the center of the floor. "What's going on?" she asked. And Diane said, "We thought it was time for a little makeover." The laughter that followed was the last normal sound Claire Hale would hear for a very long time. 300 miles away, Marcus Hale was already driving. He didn't know yet what had happened in that lounge. He didn't know about the scissors or the chair, or the way Claire had stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds. Long enough to leave, long enough to choose, before something in her simply gave out and she sat down, because she was so tired, so profoundly and completely tired, that she no longer had the strength to fight even this. He only knew that his sister had called him and not spoken and hung up, and in 22 years of knowing Claire, she had never once done that. He drove with both hands on the wheel and his jaw set, and the kind of focus he usually reserved for operations. The cold, clear, narrowing attention of a man who has been trained to walk into dangerous rooms and take control of what he finds there. Whatever he was about to find in Millhaven, Ohio, he was not going to be ready for it. But the people inside that school were going to be even less ready for him. There is a specific kind of woman who has never learned to tolerate being outshone. Not because she is unintelligent, not because she is incapable, but because at some point in her life she built her entire sense of self around being the most capable, the most liked, the most indispensable in whatever room she occupied. And when someone enters that room who threatens that position simply by existing, by being quietly good at things without needing to announce it, something ancient and ugly wakes up inside her. Diane Prewitt had been that woman for as long as she could remember. She had grown up the oldest of 4 siblings in a household where attention was scarce and had to be competed for. She had learned early that the way to survive was to be useful, to be the one who organized things, managed things, held things together, because usefulness was a form of power that no one could easily take away. She had carried that lesson into every room she'd ever entered. Her classrooms, her marriages, her friendships, the staff of Millhaven Elementary School. For 19 years, she had been the center of that place. Not officially, Gerald Mack had the title, the office, the salary, but everyone who worked there understood where the real gravity was. Diane decided the tone. Diane set the social temperature. When something needed to be addressed, a conflict between staff members, a parent complaint, a shift in the informal alliances that governed daily life in the building, it came through Diane first. She was the one people went to. She was the one who knew everything. She had worked hard for that position. She told herself that often. What she did not tell herself, what she had never once examined closely enough to name, was that the work she put into maintaining that position had very little to do with being a good teacher and everything to do with making sure no one else could become more important than her. Claire Hale had walked into her building 9 years ago with her Ohio State degree and her quiet manner and her genuine, uncalculated love for her students, and within 2 years the kids were talking about Miss Hale in the hallway the way they had once talked about her. Parents requested her classroom at enrollment. Gerald Mack had cited her reading scores at a staff meeting with an admiration in his voice that Diane had not heard directed at herself in years. She had smiled. She had congratulated Claire in the hallway afterward. She had done everything correctly, on the surface, and she had never forgiven her. Sandra Felch was simpler than Diane, which made her in some ways more dangerous. Sandra was 44, a third-grade teacher who had been at Millhaven for 11 years and had attached herself to Diane with the particular loyalty of someone who understands that proximity to power is the safest place to be. She was not a cruel person by nature. Her cruelty was borrowed, situational, activated only in the presence of someone else's permission. Around Diane, she laughed at things she wouldn't have laughed at alone. She said things she would have been ashamed of in other company. She had told herself over the years that this was just how people talked, how close friends were with each other, that it didn't really mean anything. She had said that to herself so many times it had become true. Pam Kowalski, the librarian, was 56 and tired in a way that had nothing to do with age, tired of her life having turned out smaller than she'd planned, tired of a town she'd meant to leave 20 years ago, tired of the low-grade dissatisfaction that had become her baseline. She didn't dislike Claire specifically. She disliked what Claire represented, someone who had also come back to Millhaven, and somehow, inexplicably, not been diminished by it. Someone who still seemed to find meaning in the work. That was, in Pam's private estimation, quietly offensive. And then there was Beth Arnett. Beth was 24 years old and 7 weeks into her first teaching job. She had grown up in Columbus and taken the position at Millhaven because it was the only offer she'd received. She was talented, enthusiastic, and desperately, almost painfully eager to be liked by the people around her. She had noticed the hierarchy on her second day and had understood, with the instinct of someone who had navigated social structures her entire life, exactly what was required of her. She had not thought much about Claire Hale. Claire was quiet, pleasant, occasionally helpful in the way of someone who is accustomed to giving without expecting return. Beth had no particular feelings about her. But Diane had made it clear, in the gentle, coded way she communicated these things, that Claire was not someone to be close to. And Beth, who wanted very badly to keep the only job she had filed that information away and acted accordingly. These were the four women in the lounge that afternoon. This was the room Claire Hale walked into. The idea of the scissors had not been planned. That was the most honest thing that could be said about it, and also, in a way, the most damning. Premeditated cruelty carries its own logic, its own internal justification built over time. What happened in the Millhaven Elementary Staff Lounge on that gray October afternoon was something more spontaneous and therefore more revealing. It was what these women were like when no one was watching and no plan was necessary. It had started with wine, a second bottle, opened too quickly after the first, and a conversation about Claire that had begun, as these conversations always did, in the language of concern. "I just worry about her sometimes," Diane had said, refilling her glass. "She always looks so tired." Has anyone noticed that? Sandra had noticed. Pam thought she seemed withdrawn. Beth, who had eaten lunch near Claire twice and found her perfectly pleasant, said nothing and nodded. "Her hair," Diane continued with the thoughtful expression of someone raising a difficult but necessary point. "I mean, honestly, she's a grown woman. It just looks so, I don't know, neglected." More agreement, more wine. The conversation drifting, as it always did in Diane's hands, toward the precise point she was steering it, not through force, but through incremental suggestion, each statement a small step down a slope that no one noticed they were descending. Someone should say something to her. Help her out a little. Pam had laughed first, a short, surprised sound. The laugh of someone who recognizes a line being approached and finds the approach funny before thinking about what crossing it would mean. Diane had picked up the scissors from the supply table. They were there for a bulletin board project, orange-handled, perfectly ordinary, and held them up with an expression that was half joke, half something else. "We'd be doing her a favor," she said. The laughter that followed was the sound of four women convincing themselves, in real time, that something was a joke when it wasn't. And when the door opened and Claire stood in the frame, looking at the scissors and then at the chair and then at their faces, and sat down, the laughter changed. It became something with teeth. Not one of them stopped it. That was the thing Claire would think about later, in the days and weeks that followed, when she tried to reconstruct what had happened and understand it well enough to survive it. Not one of them stopped it. Not Sandra, who she'd eaten lunch next to for years. Not Pam, who had recommended books to her students and chatted with her in the hallway every week. Not even Beth, who was new enough that she could have claimed not to understand what was happening. They had each, in their own way, chosen. The scissors were cold against Claire's neck. The first cut was the loudest, a clean, deliberate sound that seemed to fill the entire room. She sat with her hands in her lap and her eyes fixed on a point on the linoleum floor, a scuff mark near the leg of the table, and she went somewhere else inside herself, the way she had learned to do as a child when something was happening that she could not stop. She did not cry. Not yet. The crying came after the laughter peaked and then went slightly awkward, after Diane set the scissors down with a satisfied sound, after someone said something about it looking better actually, honestly, in that tone of voice that is the last refuge of people who have gone too far and need to believe they haven't. After they began to drift back to their wine and their conversation as though nothing significant had occurred, Claire walked out of the lounge and into the hallway and into the first bathroom. She reached and locked the door and looked at herself in the mirror, and that was when the crying came. Sudden and total, the kind that takes over the whole body, that makes it hard to stand. She slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold tile floor, knees pulled to her chest, cardigan wrapped around her, and she cried until there was nothing left. Then she sat in the silence for a while, breathing. Then she picked up her phone and called the only number that mattered. 4 seconds, no words, just breathing. Then she hung up. She didn't know what she'd expected. She didn't know what she'd wanted him to do. Marcus was 3 states away, and she was a grown woman sitting on a bathroom floor in a school she'd given 9 years of her life to, and nothing about her situation was something that could be fixed by a phone call. But she had needed, for just a moment, to be connected to someone who knew who she actually was. Outside the bathroom window, the October sky had darkened to the color of a bruise. The parking lot below was almost empty. A cold wind moved through the trees along the fence line, pulling the last of the leaves loose, scattering them across the asphalt. Somewhere on Interstate 70, a pair of headlights cut through the gathering dark. Moving fast, moving west. Moving toward Millhaven with the quiet, absolute certainty of someone who has already decided what happens next. Marcus Hale had been inside worse buildings than Millhaven Elementary School. He had cleared rooms in Kandahar with nothing but a flashlight and a sidearm. He had walked into warehouses in Juarez where the smell told you everything before your eyes adjusted to the dark. He had stood in hallways overseas where the silence itself was a threat. The specific, loaded silence of a space that had recently held violence and hadn't finished with it yet. None of that prepared him for the particular quality of quiet he found in this building. He pulled into the parking lot at 6:47 p.m. The lot was almost empty. 3 cars remaining, including Claire's Honda Civic, which he recognized immediately. The sight of it tightened something in his chest. He sat in the truck for exactly 4 seconds, running the scan he always ran before entering an unknown space. Exits, sightlines, variables. Then he got out. He was still in his tactical gear. He hadn't stopped to change. There had been a moment on I-70, somewhere around Columbus, when he'd thought about pulling over, trading the jacket for something from the duffel in the back seat, arriving looking less like what he was. He'd decided against it. He didn't know yet what he was walking into. If he needed to look like something, he'd rather look like this. The front doors of the school were unlocked. He pushed through them and into the main corridor. Linoleum floors, fluorescent lighting, the smell of chalk and cafeteria food and institutional cleaning product that was the same in every school in America, regardless of what state you were in. Bulletin boards along the walls, student artwork, a hand-lettered banner that read, "Millhaven Rockets, reaching for the stars." He moved down the hallway with the unhurried, deliberate pace of someone who is in no hurry because they have already decided the outcome. At the end of the corridor, a door stood partially open. Light inside, voices, low, female, the relaxed cadence of people who believe themselves unobserved. The sound of a bottle being set down on a table, and then, from a door on his left, the women's restroom, a sound that stopped him completely. Crying. Quiet, exhausted, the kind that has been going on for a long time and has almost run out of itself. The sound of someone who has been alone with something terrible for too long. He knew that crying. He had heard it once before, 20 years ago, when their mother had sat outside his bedroom door and cried like that after their father left, quietly, so the kids wouldn't hear, not realizing that quiet grief carries further than loud grief. He had been 17. He had not known what to do then. He knew exactly what to do now. He knocked on the bathroom door. 2 knocks, soft. "Claire." The crying stopped. A long silence. "Claire." "It's me." Another silence. Then the sound of movement. Slow, like someone who has been sitting on a hard floor and has to remind their body how to stand. The lock turned. The door opened. She looked at him. He looked at her. He had seen a great many things in his career that required him to maintain composure. He had been trained, extensively and at considerable cost to the federal government, to control his physiological response to distressing stimuli. Heart rate, breathing, the expression on his face. All of that training held, mostly. Except for 2 seconds, just 2, when he first saw his sister standing in that doorway, and something moved across his face that he did not bother to hide. Her hair, the cardigan with a dark mark on the shoulder. her eyes, red and swollen, searching his face with an expression that was partly relief and partly something else, something like shame, which made his jaw tighten in a way that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with whoever had put it there. "You drove from Arlington," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. You didn't have to—" "Claire." She stopped. "Tell me what happened." She told him in the hallway, standing with her back against the wall and her arms crossed over her chest, her voice flat and even in the way of someone who has made a decision to report facts rather than feel them. She was good at that. She had always been good at that. He recognized it because he did the same thing. She told him about Diane, about 9 years of it, the looks, the exclusions, the comments delivered in the voice of concern. She told him about the wellness afternoon 3 weeks ago and the sticky note invitation and standing at the edge of the room with the warm Chardonnay. She told him about tonight, the lounge, the door, the scissors, the chair. Her voice didn't break once. She kept her eyes on a point past his shoulder, and she told him all of it in about 4 minutes. When she finished, he didn't say anything for a moment. "Who was in the room?" he asked. "Marcus. I'm not going to do anything. I just want to know." She looked at him. She knew him well enough to know that the two statements were not necessarily in conflict. She told him anyway. Diane, Sandra, Pam, Beth, 4 names. He filed them. "Is the principal still here?" "Gerald?" "No. He leaves at 4. "Do you know which car is Diane's?" "Marcus." "Claire." He met her eyes. "I'm not going to touch anyone. I need you to believe that." She studied him for a long moment. Then, "The silver Subaru, 3rd row." He nodded. He looked down the corridor toward the light under the lounge door. Then he looked back at his sister. "Go to my truck," he said. "Keys are in the cup holder. Turn the heat on. I'll be 10 minutes. "What are you going to do?" He didn't answer that because the honest answer was that he wasn't entirely sure yet. He knew the shape of it. He was going to walk into that room and he was going to make these women understand, with absolute clarity and no room for misinterpretation, the precise nature of what they had done and what it would cost them. He was not going to raise his voice. He was not going to threaten anyone in any way that was actionable. He had done enough of these conversations, in enough difficult rooms, to know that the most effective version of them was the quietest. But first he needed to stand in the doorway and let them see him. That was the part that mattered most, not what he said. The moment before he said anything, when they looked up and understood that the world had just changed in a way they hadn't anticipated. That moment was for Claire. 10 minutes, he said again. "Go." She went. He watched her push through the front doors into the parking lot. Then he turned and walked down the corridor toward the lounge. The 4 women inside did not hear him approach. They were in the middle of a conversation that had the slightly forced quality of people who are trying to convince themselves that everything is fine. Diane was speaking. Something about the school's fall fundraiser, her voice carrying its usual authority, slightly louder than necessary, in the way of someone who is filling silence on purpose. Sandra was laughing at something. Pam was refilling her glass. Beth was sitting slightly apart from the others, her hands around her cup, looking at the table. The door opened. The conversation stopped. Marcus Hale stood in the doorway of the Millhaven Elementary Staff Lounge in full tactical gear. Colete, gloves, the faint residue of a very long day written into every line of his face and posture, and looked at the 4 women at the table with an expression that was not anger. It was something more precise than anger. Something that had been distilled down from anger into a form that was colder and considerably more effective. Nobody spoke. The silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of statement. Diane recovered first, because Diane always recovered first. It was her defining skill, the thing that had kept her at the center of this building for 19 years. She straightened in her chair and arranged her face into the expression of polite confusion she used when she wanted to appear reasonable. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was steady, credit where it was due. Marcus let another 2 seconds pass before he answered. In his experience, those 2 seconds did more work than anything he could say. "My name is Marcus Hale," he said. "Claire is my sister." The temperature in the room dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the October air outside. Sandra's smile disappeared. Pam set her glass down with a sound that was too loud in the new silence. Beth looked up from the table for the first time, and her face when she saw him, the gear, the posture, the absolute stillness of a man who is accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in the room, went completely blank. Diane did not look away from him. He noted that. Filed it. "I drove from Arlington, Virginia," he continued in the same quiet, level tone, "because my sister called me and didn't speak and hung up. In 22 years, she has never done that. Not once." He paused. "I'd like to understand what happened in this room tonight." "We were just—" Sandra started. "I wasn't speaking to you," Marcus said without looking at her. His eyes stayed on Diane. Sandra closed her mouth. "It was just a bit of fun," Diane said. Her voice had not changed. She was good, he thought. She was very good. In a different context, he might have respected it. "We didn't mean any harm." "A bit of fun," he repeated. She wasn't upset. She was sitting on the floor of the bathroom crying when I got here," he said. Still quiet, still level. "She's been at this school for 9 years. She buys her students school supplies with her own money. She stays 3 days a week after hours for kids who need extra help. She has given this building more than it has ever given her." He let that land. And tonight, 4 adult women held scissors to her head for fun. The room was absolutely silent. Beth Arnett looked like she might be sick. Pam Kowalski was staring at the table. Sandra Felch had her arms wrapped around herself as though she'd gone cold. Diane Prewitt was still looking at him, still composed. But something had shifted behind her eyes. Something small and involuntary, the first crack in a wall that had been standing for 19 years. "I'm not here to threaten anyone," Marcus said. "I want to be clear about that." He looked at each of them in turn, Sandra, Pam, Beth, and then back to Diane, where his gaze stopped. "But I am going to have a conversation with Principal Mack tomorrow morning, and with the district office, and if necessary, and I want you to hear this carefully, with the county sheriff's office, regarding what constitutes assault in the state of Ohio." Diane's composure flickered, just once, just for a moment. "What happened tonight doesn't go away because nobody filmed it," he continued. "It doesn't go away because it happened after hours or because you've convinced yourselves it was harmless. It happened. My sister is in my truck right now. I can see her from where I'm standing." He glanced toward the window, the parking lot, his truck, the small figure visible through the windshield. Then he looked back. "She is the kindest person I have ever known. And I have spent 15 years working with people in very difficult circumstances. And I can tell you with complete confidence that the capacity for cruelty I saw in this room tonight is not something I expected to find in a place like this." He stepped back from the doorway. "Enjoy your evening," he said. And he walked back down the corridor, through the front doors, and out into the cold October night. Claire was in the passenger seat with the heat running when he got to the truck. She had her knees pulled up and her arms around them, the way she used to sit as a kid when something was bothering her and she didn't want to talk about it yet. He got in, closed the door. The cab filled with the sound of the engine and the heat and the rain that had started while he was inside, tapping against the windshield in small, steady increments. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "What did you say to them?" she asked finally. "The truth," he said. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the windshield. "Are they okay?" He turned to look at her then, because only Claire would ask that. Only Claire, after everything, would ask if the people who'd hurt her were okay. He felt something move through his chest that he didn't have a word for. Something between admiration and grief. "They're fine," he said. She nodded, looked back at the rain. "I don't want to go home tonight," she said quietly. "My apartment is... I just don't want to be there." "You're not going home tonight," he said. "I got a room at the Holiday Inn on Route 9. She looked at him. You already... I called ahead on the way here. He put the truck in reverse. We'll get dinner. Real food, not whatever's in your fridge. He glanced at her. You still like that diner on Maple? The one with the bad coffee and the good pie? Something happened to her face then. Not quite a smile, not yet, but the beginning of one. The first softening of something that had been locked tight for hours. The coffee is terrible, she said. Yeah, he said. It really is. He pulled out of the parking lot. The school shrank in the rearview mirror. Its lit windows, its empty lot. The four women somewhere inside it who were going to spend the rest of the night thinking about what comes next. He already knew what came next. He'd meant every word he'd said in that lounge, and tomorrow morning he would follow through on all of it. But that was tomorrow. Tonight his sister was in the seat beside him, and the rain was steady on the glass, and somewhere on Maple Street there was bad coffee and good pie, and that was enough to begin with. She woke up at 5:43 in the morning, the way she always did, before the alarm, before the light, in that thin gray space between sleep and consciousness where the mind hasn't yet remembered what it's carrying. Then it remembered. Claire lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling of the Holiday Inn room on Route 9, listening to the sound of Marcus breathing in the other bed. He slept the way he did everything, quietly, without waste, completely. She had always envied him that. She had been a light sleeper her entire life, waking at small sounds, lying awake with things she couldn't resolve. She got up carefully, not wanting to wake him, and went to the bathroom and closed the door and turned on the light. The mirror was unavoidable. She had not looked at herself properly since the school bathroom the night before. She had kept her eyes down in the truck, at the diner, walking through the hotel parking lot in the rain. She had understood, without deciding it consciously, that she was not ready, that there was a version of this that she needed to come to on her own terms, in her own time, without anyone watching. Now she stood in front of the mirror and looked. It was worse than she'd expected and better than she'd feared, which was not the same as being okay. Diane had not been precise. The cuts were uneven, shorter on the left side, longer on the right, with a ragged section near the crown where the scissors had caught and pulled. It didn't look like a choice anyone would make. It looked like what it was, something done to her against her will by someone who wanted to leave a mark. She stood there for a long time. She thought about the 9 years, the sticky note invitation, the Christmas party and the smile that didn't reach Diane's eyes, the group chat she'd been removed from, the slow, patient, grinding work of being made to feel like she was less capable, less worthy, less deserving of basic dignity, by people who had decided, for reasons that had everything to do with their own diminishment and nothing to do with her actual worth, that she was a safe target. She thought about room 14, her 22 students, the wall of hard things in the back of the classroom, the granola bars in her desk drawer. She thought about Marcus, asleep in the next room, who had driven 300 miles without being asked because 4 seconds of silence on a phone line had been enough. And she thought about herself, the version of herself that had walked into that lounge last night, not because she didn't know better, not because she couldn't read the room, but because she was tired, and tired people sometimes walk through doors they should close. And sometimes the thing waiting on the other side of those doors, as terrible as it is also the last thing that needed to happen before something changed. She reached up and touched her hair, ran her fingers along the uneven edge near her ear. Then she took a breath, turned off the light, and went back to bed. She slept until 7. When she woke up again, Marcus was already dressed, sitting at the small table by the window with 2 cups of coffee from the machine in the hallway, looking at his phone with the focused expression that meant he was already working. "You called the school," she said. It wasn't a question. "I called Gerald Mack's office at 6:58, he said. His assistant picked up. "I have an appointment at 8:30. He looked up. "You don't have to come." "I know." She sat up and reached for the coffee. It was bad, worse than the diner, which was saying something. She drank it anyway. "I'm coming." Gerald Mack was 58 years old and had been principal of Millhaven Elementary for 14 of them. He was a decent man in the way that many administrators are decent, genuinely well-intentioned, conflict-averse to a degree that had occasionally allowed things to fester that a braver person might have addressed earlier, and possessed of the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent a decade and a half managing other adults while also being responsible for the education of several hundred children. He had not slept well. His assistant had called him at home the previous evening. Something about a man in tactical gear in the building after hours, the staff in the lounge, Claire Hale, and the pieces of it had assembled themselves into a picture that had sat heavily on his chest all night. When Marcus and Claire walked into his office at 8:31, he stood up immediately. He looked at Claire's hair. He looked at her face. He sat back down. "Claire," he said, I don't have the words for how sorry I am." "Gerald," Marcus said, settling into the chair across the desk with the ease of someone who has conducted 1,000 meetings in rooms where the power dynamic needed to be established early. "I appreciate that. But I think what would be more useful than words this morning is a conversation about next steps." He placed a folder on the desk. Gerald looked at it. "What is this?" "Documentation," Marcus said. "Ohio Revised Code, Section 2903. 13. Assault, physical harm. Section 2903-22. Menacing. A summary of case law regarding workplace harassment in educational settings, and the contact information for the district superintendent, the Ohio Department of Education's Office of Professional Conduct, and the Millhaven County Sheriff's Department." He paused. "I've spoken with an attorney this morning, briefly, by phone. She'll be available for a longer conversation this afternoon if needed." Gerald opened the folder. He looked at the first page for a long moment without speaking. "I want to be clear about what I'm asking for," Marcus continued. "I'm not here to destroy anyone's career for its own sake. I'm here because my sister has spent 9 years in this building being systematically excluded, undermined, and last night physically assaulted by colleagues who believed there would be no consequences. I want to know what consequences there will be, and I want to know today." Gerald looked up from the folder. He looked at Claire. "What do you want, Claire?" It was the first time she realized that anyone in this building had asked her that in 9 years. She had thought about it in the truck on the way over. She had been honest with herself, the way she tried to be honest about things that mattered, not performing reasonableness, not defaulting to accommodation, but actually asking herself what she wanted and being willing to sit with the answer. "I want it to be on record," she said. "I want what happened last night documented formally. I want HR involved. I want the 3 teachers who have been here long enough to know better to face a formal review." She paused. Beth Arnett is 24 years old and 7 weeks into her first job. I don't want her career ended over one terrible decision. Another pause. "And I want to keep my classroom." Gerald nodded slowly. "You're not going anywhere, Claire. That I can promise you right now." "I know," she said. And she did know. She had always known, on some level, that the building itself was not the problem. The building was room 14. The building was 22 kids and a wall full of hard things and granola bars in a desk drawer. The building was hers, and it had always been hers, and it was time to stop acting like it wasn't. What followed over the next 2 weeks was not dramatic in the way that the night itself had been dramatic. Consequences rarely are. They tend to arrive quietly, in the form of meetings and paperwork and formal letters and conversations conducted in administrative offices with HR representatives present, and the slow, grinding machinery of institutional accountability that moves without urgency, but does, eventually, move. Diane Prewitt was placed on administrative leave, pending a formal investigation 4 days after Marcus's meeting with Gerald Mack. The investigation, conducted by the district HR office, took 11 days. Its findings were not made public. These things rarely are. But the outcome was, Diane did not return to Millhaven Elementary. She resigned in lieu of termination, which was the option her union representative had negotiated for her, and which preserved her pension but ended her tenure in the district permanently. Sandra Felch received a formal written reprimand and was required to complete workplace conduct training. She taught third grade at Millhaven for one more semester before requesting a transfer to a school in the next county. Whether that request was made voluntarily or strongly encouraged was a matter of some speculation among the remaining staff, but either way, she was gone by February. Pam Kowalski kept her position. She received the same formal reprimand as Sandra. She was quieter after that, noticeably, permanently quieter. And in the months that followed, she developed a habit of stopping by room 14 on Friday afternoons to ask if Claire needed anything. Claire always said no, but she appreciated the asking. Beth Arnett came to Claire's classroom on the third day after everything happened, before school started, and knocked on the open door and stood in the frame looking like someone who had been rehearsing what to say for 48 hours and had decided none of it was adequate. "I should have said something," Beth said, "or left, or I don't know. Something. I didn't, and I've been—" She stopped, started again. "I'm sorry, Miss Hale. I'm genuinely sorry." Claire looked at her for a moment. 24 years old, 7 weeks into her first job, standing in a doorway having chosen this time to walk through it. "I know you are," Claire said. "Come in. Close the door." Beth came in. Closed the door. And they talked for 20 minutes before the first bell, really talked the way Claire talked to her students, honestly and without performance, about what had happened and why and what it meant and what came after. By the end of it, Beth was crying quietly and Claire was not, which was, Claire thought, a reasonable reversal of how things had been a week ago. She handed Beth a granola bar from the desk drawer on her way out. Beth laughed, a surprised, wet sound, and took it. Marcus stayed in Millhaven for 4 days. He slept at the Holiday Inn, ate at the diner on Maple Street with the terrible coffee, and spent his mornings handling the administrative pieces that required his presence. In the afternoons he drove around the town, the grain elevator, the Dollar General, the auto parts plant on Route 9, the roads he'd grown up on and left and not come back to often enough. He didn't say much about what he was thinking during those drives. He rarely did. On the last evening before he drove back to Arlington, he and Claire sat on the steps of her apartment building with takeout containers from the Chinese place on 5th Street that had been there since they were children. The October air was cold and clean, the sky finally clear after days of rain, the stars sharper than anything you could see from a city. "You should call more," she said. "I know. Not just when you're passing through or when something happens. Just call." "I will." She looked at him. "You always say that. This time I mean it differently." She considered that. Accepted it, provisionally, in the way she accepted most things from him, with a clear eye and a certain amount of faith built on 22 years of evidence. "What happens now?" she asked. "For you, work." He was quiet for a moment. He'd been offered a position 6 months ago, supervisory, less field time based in D.C. He had been putting off the decision in the way he put off decisions that required him to change something fundamental about how he lived. He had told himself he needed more time. "There's a position," he said. "I've been thinking about it." "D.C.? Yeah. That's closer than Arlington. Little bit." She was quiet. Then, "Take it, Marcus." He looked at her. "You've been in the field for 15 years, she said. "Take the position. Be somewhere. Be reachable." She paused. "I'm not saying that for me. I'm saying it because you're 41 years old and you eat bad diner food alone and you drive 300 miles in tactical gear because your sister didn't speak on a phone call, and at some point—" She stopped. "At some point you should also let someone do that for you." He didn't answer for a long time. They ate their takeout in the cold and watched a car move slowly down the street below them, its headlights cutting through the dark. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "That's different from what you usually say." "Yeah," he said. "It is." On the Monday after Marcus left, Claire Hale walked into Millhaven Elementary at 7:15 as always. She made coffee in the break room. She corrected the last of a set of book reports. She had her classroom ready 15 minutes before the first bell. Her hair was still uneven. She had an appointment with a stylist in Columbus on Saturday. She'd made it the morning after she'd stood in the bathroom mirror at the Holiday Inn and looked at herself and decided that what came next was up to her. The stylist had said they could work with what was there, shape it into something intentional, make a choice out of what had been done without her consent. Claire had thought that was exactly the right way to describe it. Make a choice out of what had been done without her consent. She had written that down in the small notebook she kept in her desk drawer, the one she'd been writing in since graduate school. She wrote down things that seemed important enough to remember, phrases, observations, moments that deserved more than the pace of ordinary life allowed. She read them back sometimes, when she needed to locate herself. She read it back that morning, sitting at her desk in the gray October light with her coffee and her stack of book reports. And she thought about 9 years. About what they had cost her and what they hadn't. Because they hadn't cost her room 14, hadn't cost her the wall of hard things, hadn't cost her the 22 kids who came through her door every morning and trusted her with the parts of themselves they didn't show anywhere else. That was still hers. It had always been hers. The first bell rang. Footsteps in the hallway, small ones, quick. The particular sound of children who are genuinely glad to be somewhere. Her door opened. A boy named Daniel, 8 years old, perpetually early, with a gap where his front tooth used to be and a habit of bringing her drawings he'd done at home that he claimed were for no particular reason, stood in the frame and looked at her hair with the frank, unfiltered assessment of a child who has not yet learned to pretend not to notice things. "Miss Hale," he said, "your hair is different." "It is," she said. He considered this for a moment. Then, with the conclusive certainty of someone who has thought it through and arrived at a verdict, "I like it." She smiled, the real kind, the one that started somewhere deeper than her face. "Thank you, Daniel," she said. "Come in. Close the door." He came in, he closed the door, and the day began.